currently 37 countries around the world, including other minerals-rich countries like Norway, Nigeria and China, which have got sovereign wealth funds. It means putting aside some of the huge inflow of profits from a boom time for the future. Sovereign wealth funds are able to be used for future education, health, transport. But for example, here in Australia, where we're lagging right behind in transport, it would be a prime funding source for high-speed rail. Trains carrying passengers between our big capital cities, for example, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, at 300, 400, 500 kilometres an hour. That's where the rest of the world's going. That's where we should be going. It could also be used for big new solar power stations, baseload power stations. It can be used to develop the nation's future in ways that we might not be thinking about now, but will be inevitably as we go down the line. The sovereign wealth funds are very often invested overseas to stop inflation in the home country, but the money is used from time to time to invest in infrastructure, for example, that otherwise is beyond the reach of or the planning ability of the private sector, and maybe too much at any given time on the budget of the home country. It's a very plain good housekeeping. It means putting aside some of the money that's flowing in today for the nation's needs in the future. I first flagged this a year ago. The Greens are going to continue to pursue the government over this. Malcolm Turnbull's since spoken about it, and we have senior economists backing this as a good idea for this nation's future. Now, this is the Greens again being economically responsible. We challenge both the big parties to back a sovereign wealth fund. I want to hear Tony Abbott backing it. Certainly we'll continue to pursue Julia Gillard over it. And the massive profits that the mining corporations are currently pouring overseas to investors overseas, why shouldn't we be putting more of that into Australian investment for Australia's future? Sovereign wealth fund ought to be there in next Tuesday's budget, but the government hasn't taken it up. It ought to be there in Tony Abbott's reply, but he hasn't taken it up. The Greens will certainly be promoting a sovereign wealth fund. I think it's inevitable Australia will get a sovereign wealth fund based on the current booming mineral resources sector. But we need the nous, the common sense, the sheer practice that's been so successful overseas brought here to Australia in this boom period.
How much money would you see put into this fund, and specifically where would the money come from? Specific companies?
Well, it comes from taxing. For example, the super profits tax, which Labor's much reduced and which Tony Abbott doesn't want at all, ought to be going in big measure into a sovereign wealth fund. The Norwegians have put $500 billion into a sovereign wealth fund. Now that's little Norway with its oil and gas reserves in the North Sea, because it knows that the day's going to come when they won't be there. But it'll have this very gilt-lined piggy bank for the nation to draw on in the future. That's just good housekeeping. Now, if the Norwegians can do that, why can't we? If Nigeria, which also knows that its great oil reserves are going to one day not be there, is investing in a sovereign wealth fund, why isn't Australia? It would be foolish to think that our mineral abundance is inexhaustible. It's not. And we should be putting some of the extraordinary profits, these hundreds of billions that are flowing out of the mining sector every year, into the future of Australia.
And so obviously this will diminish the profits of some of these big mining companies. Do you think that you're going to come up against a lot of resistance from those sort of parts of the sector?
Well, of course the big mining companies are going to want to put their shareholders from Tokyo to London to New York ahead of the average Australian. But what we're saying is the average Australian needs to have some of this wealth put away for her or his future, for their children's future. And that's what governments are charged to do. We don't have the big corporations running this country. We have elected governments to do it. They're doing extraordinarily well. They're into windfall profits, and some of those profits should be put aside for the nation's future through a sovereign wealth fund. And there's much more experienced economists than me calling for just that. They should be heeded.
You said that this is something that you proposed a year ago. Have you had I guess, consultation with the sector on what this might entail for them?
Well, we've been very open in the public arena about it, and I can tell you I've had no adverse reaction from it. In fact, I do hear and watch the economic debate, and you'll see that there's a very big strength of feeling amongst economists, including in, of course, the private sector, who feel that a sovereign wealth fund is the direction we should be going in Australia.
We're seeing constraints on the budget. Is this something which is likely going to happen each consecutive year, and another reason why that fund should be established?
Yeah, it is. There are constraints on the budget. We've got the government flagging cuts to a whole range of services and to amenities that Australians want to see well funded in Tuesday's budget. On top of not having the super profits tax, they're aiming to give a tax cut to the corporations who should be putting some of these profits into a sovereign wealth fund. So instead of the money pouring into the public purse, it's pouring into shareholders' pockets, including, if you look at the coal industry, 60% of those pockets out of this country. So the money's pouring out of the country to line the pockets of already wealthy people overseas, instead of going into the country to ensure that we've got the money for essential services and building infrastructure in the future of this great country of ours.
Are you concerned that that Gillard might soften on the carbon tax to keep big business on side?
Well, of course, we're seeing a prodigious lobby against the carbon tax at the moment, and Julia Gillard has reiterated the timetable of July the 1st, that we should have the carbon price, which may or may not be. We'll see. The plan that's been announced is for a carbon tax on the polluting companies, not on anybody else, but directly on the polluting companies, moving to an emissions trading scheme. But that's still being a matter of discussion between the government, the Greens and the independents, who are seeing this as a responsible way to go forward. So those talks are not yet complete. But, you know, let's have a fair dinkum debate. This false headline in today's Australian, which Gail Kelly, the head of Westpac, has said is wrong and annoying, which misrepresents the bank, is part of an editorial charged by this newspaper against the carbon price, and it misleads readers. And it's we can do with better, more dinkum, more honest reporting than we're seeing here in the Australian newspaper as we debate the merits, and for the Australian and for some others, the arguments they may have against a carbon price. But let's have a public that's properly and fairly informed about the opinion of senior entities in this debate in Australia, not misrepresented as we're seeing on the front of today's Australian.
About 60% of the public, new polls showed last night, are against the carbon tax. Are you fighting a losing battle?
Yeah, no. One of the things that's happening here is, of course, the carbon price has not yet been established. I think most people, after Tony Abbott's trip around the country, think they're going to be directly taxed. They won't be. It's the big polluters who get taxed, and it's the average taxpayer who gets compensated. Under Tony Abbott's alternative proposal, he'll take money out of the taxpayers, out of Treasury, the taxpayers' funds, and give it to the big polluters, and that's going to cost the average household $720 by the end of this decade. The difference between what we are proposing and what Tony Abbott's proposing is we are proposing that polluters will pay and householders will be compensating. Tony Abbott's proposing that householders will pay and the polluters get compensated. And when that debate comes on, and I'm very happy to debate this with Tony Abbott anywhere he likes to, he's going to be a loser. And he's going to find that the intelligence of the Australian people is on the side of us taking action on climate change through a carbon price.
You mentioned before July is the estimated date for a carbon price and also compensation, I imagine. Is this soon enough? Should the Gillard government release these details sooner?
Well, the details aren't there. It hasn't been negotiated. And everybody knows that this is a process of negotiation where the agreement on a carbon price has not yet been struck. And the timetable is to go to July the 1st. That was always the intended approximate timetable. And there's a process of negotiation underway, and so there should be. Tony Abbott's plan comes without negotiation, without reference to the Australian people, without reference to the key players, and from a sceptic on climate change. He is going to punish householders and reward polluters. We want to see it the other way around.
Last night, the business lobby met with Julia Gillard. Is that a concern that that's happening while this tax is still being negotiated?
No, I mean the government, like the Greens, like the opposition and the independents, ought to be meeting with people in the community widely. I would like to see Julia Gillard meeting now with the social sector, with community representatives, and indeed the environmental sector. A dinner at Kirribilli with those people who represent the wider Australian community in the lead up to the finalisation of carbon price negotiations would be seen as a fair and balancing thing for our Prime Minister to be undertaking.
And if I can ask you a couple of questions about the Forest Peace Deal law. Is there a fear that the deal could fall over if in the budget Gillard fails to set aside potentially millions of dollars to ensure that this deal goes ahead?
No, I don't think so, because as far as I know, there's been no assessment. I asked the government about the cost of the end of native forest logging in Tasmania. They couldn't give an answer to that. I asked them about the cost of proper management of future World Heritage areas if our forests are protected. They couldn't give an answer to that. I then asked the government what the cost of ending native forest logging in Australia is concerned, and they said $4 billion. So they can estimate what's going on the mainland, but they can't estimate what's the potential cost in Tasmania. But what we want to do is make sure that it's not a cost, that it's a win. We know that the industry is an extremist. I read in the Narooma News that there is an ex-Tasmanian contractor who got 800,000 plus out of the current compensation scheme and has gone to southeast New South Wales to outcompete others in logging of forests there, and it's been a matter of protest by environmentalists in that neck of the woods elsewhere in the country. We've got to be very careful that compensation is fair and it ends up with a good result for everybody. I'm particularly interested that there's an investment in jobs as well as protecting forests. And as far as I can see, the government and Mr. Kelty have not yet been able to come up with an assessment on that. Certainly, in my questioning of the government, we haven't received an answer on it yet.
Okay, and so I guess will you be speaking to Julia Gillard and seeing if when these figures are released, if she will be investing?
We proposed, the Greens proposed in December, and I wrote to the Treasurer about ensuring that there was budgetary provision for a forest peace deal and forward movement here in Tasmania. I haven't had a response on that. I expect it won't be in the budget on Tuesday night, but there is a heavy responsibility on the Treasurer and the government in Canberra, along with the government here in Tasmania, to be looking seriously at how to ensure that we do have this win-win translocation of the industry out of the destruction of Tasmania's forest amenity, which has got so many other economic prospects, into a new a plantation-based future forestry industry based on current plantations in Tasmania.
Has the industry received enough support? Could any further money being invested into the forestry industry be justified to keep this deal on the table? Or is the deal paramount?
Well, the industry asked environmentalists to go into an agreement. We're now well down the line from that. What I think we do have to be looking at is how to ensure that, as with the Franklin River, the economic and job creating prospects are capitalised on. The protection of the wild rivers in Western Tasmania has been a real honeypot for visitors from around the world and around Australia, and it's created jobs and it's made people feel good about that region, and it's led to a lot of investment. We can see the same happening with the forests. It takes a bit of forward thinking and an end to the rundown of jobs which we've seen in the current forest industry. The forest industry is a job shedder, but presenting this state's magnificent forest to the rest of the world is a jobs winner. That's where we need to be going.
Just one last question, Bob. Has the state government done enough to make sure the statement of principles is finalised as a deal?
Well, you see, I'm outside the negotiating process. The industry and environmental representatives and no doubt state government are intimately involved in that. My job as the leader of the Greens in the National Parliament is to do all we can to protect Tasmania's wild forests and its fantastic wildlife for the future of this state's economy as well as its environment and employment creation. But the questions of whether the state government or anybody else has done enough yet remain to be answered. I think if the agreement succeeds, then people will think that's a great thing. But a stumbling block will be the pulp mill. Investing huge amounts of public money into a mill that's going to create 300 or so jobs would be very unwise, because dollar for dollar public investment in other sectors of the economy will produce a much better jobs dividend.